Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. The last video I did was about George Harrison, and I was finding out information about him that we might all not have known, and it was from the book George Harrison, The Reluctant Beatle by Philip Norman. So I'm going to go through this book again and to the middle section of the book to see if there's more information that we might not have known about George. So now we come to the marriage of Patty and George. Patty said the first 2 years of marriage to George was great. He was divine and sweet and kind, and her mother's siblings and step-siblings all adored him. But things changed after George and Patty went to Rishikesh. The Maharishi gave him a purpose, but Patty felt that, as she put it, it took some of the lightness out of his soul. Patty said he was obsessively meditate and chant and would spin a prayer wheel instead of giving him inner peace that made him moody and grouchy. And Patty felt that he never reached the level he wanted to. And Derek Taylor, he recalled being on the plane ride with George. George was chanting quietly, and a cabin attendant asked him if he wanted anything. He snapped and said, "F off, can't you see I'm meditating?" So, in the time of their marriage, it wasn't expected that a wife should work, and George didn't want Patty to, so he made her give up her modeling career. So when George was working with the band, Patty would be escorted to a theater or ballet by Peter Brown, who was gay. George didn't like her going to new places or meeting new people. And she would be at their Kinfon's bungalow in Esher. Patty looked for ways to occupy herself, and she would run an antique stall with her sister, and she started a course of flying lessons. When George was in India, he was interested in the images of Krishna, the love god. He had lots of concubines, and George found out that in Hinduism, sex didn't diminish divinity. That made Patty nervous, thinking of how many women George could be with when he was away from her. And when Patty and George went out with Eric, him and his girlfriend, French model Charlotte Martin, Patty didn't notice Eric looking at her longingly. She just thought he was rather nice. So Patty and Charlotte became friends, and when her and Eric broke up, Patty invited her to stay at their place in Kinfon's until she could figure out what she wanted to do. So during this time, Charlotte didn't seem upset about her breakup with Eric, and it seemed like Charlotte was getting close to George. So when Patty confronted George, he denied it and said she was being paranoid. And she decided to leave the house, and she stayed with friends for 3 days. Eric called her and asked if she wanted to go to dinner. And Patty said no, she thought it was a setup. So then George called Patty 6 days later. He said that Charlotte had gone back to France, and he begged her to come home, and Patty did. Clapton decided to move away from the city when he learned that he was on the hit list of a drug squad detective, Sergeant Norman Pelcher. And he bought a country mansion named Hurtswood Edge in Surrey. It was 8 miles from George's Esher house. George and Eric spent long hours at each other's houses, and Eric was not only interested in George and their friendship, he was interested in Patty too. So George didn't suspect anything, because at that time, Eric, who was 25, was engaged to 17-year-old girlfriend, the Honorable Alice Ormsby Gorge. Clapton could see that George was cold, and he was obsessively meditating and was being unfaithful. And Eric would try to make Patty feel better by giving her compliments on her clothes or her cooking. And near the Beatles' breakup, George was still taking LSD. Patty didn't want to use it anymore. George would take it by sometimes going to the park next to their psychedelic bungalow and have a trip sitting under a tree. The park belonged to the Esher's Claremont estate, which was part of the expensive private school. One evening, a caretaker was closing the gates and saw George. He didn't know who George Harrison was and told him to leave in a rude way. So that was the last straw for George, and he decided he wanted to live somewhere else. So Patty spent most of the year driving all over southern England to view potential properties. George didn't have a list of what he wanted in the property, but he did want his own park where he would be safe from caretakers. And he almost got an estate called Plumpton Place in East Sussex. It was a moated Elizabethan manor house with gardens laid out by Sir Edwin Lutyens, the architect of New Delhi, and the great Victorian landscaper Gertrude Jekyll. The lady, though, that owned the place decided she didn't want to sell the property to a rock musician. But later she must have gotten an offer she couldn't refuse, because she then sold her property later to Jimmy Page. So then George buys Friar Park. It was a 19th century Gothic-style architecture, and it was built in the 1890s by Sir Frank Crisp, who was a wealthy London solicitor. His place was almost like a Disneyland, and he had his place open to the public. When he died in 1919, none of his family wanted to preserve it, so it was a bit of bad shape. The last owners were Salesian sisters, and they were teaching nuns who turned the place into a school. And when George and Patty arrived to look at the place, it was occupied by a monk and 4 nuns. The place was a wreck inside and out. They had let the local building firms use the garden and lake as a garbage dump. George was interested in the verse that was etched in the garden wall. Scan not a friend with a microscope glass. You know his faults, so let his foibles pass. Patty said that George felt the verse was speaking to him, telling him not to be resentful toward the other Beatles. So George at first wanted the place to be a religious institution of an Indian kind, but then he changed his mind. So George, Patty, and his personal assistant, Terry Doran, moved into Friar Park in March of 1970, and it was just after George's 27th birthday. There were no bedrooms that could be used, so they had to sleep in sleeping bags in the front hall, and they kept warm by burning logs in the fireplace. And then a scary incident happened one night. Patty heard a noise up above, and she ran up the staircase and saw a man climbing in the second-story window. She shouted, "Burglar!" and the man ran away, thankfully. So, as I mentioned in the last video, George had an interest in architecture when he was a boy, so he wanted to restore Friar Park to its Victorian splendor. And George found maps and blueprints from the construction and the library, and it was left by Sir Frank. So it took 4.5 years and plenty of money to achieve his goals. So George, he added a professional recording studio, and he wanted to be a producer, and he also used it when he wanted to record his albums. So when George was growing up, his father had a front and back garden at the house. He had vegetables and flowers, and George helped him with the planting and picking. He liked to have his hands in the dirt. The Friar Park gardens were massive. There was acres of lawns to mow and flower beds that needed to be brought back to life. Sir Frank had many exotic plants and shrubs from his foreign travels, so George had to figure out how to care for them. And then the topiary needed to be clipped, and there were hothouses with grapevines and orchids that needed to be tended to. George got a horticultural expert to identify the plants and tell him how to take care of them. And then he got his former gardener to follow him. And then soon he had a gardening staff that numbered 8. George could be generous. He had bought Patty's mom a home, but he didn't pay his help a lot. George remembered that his father never earned more than 10 quid a week being a bus driver, so he didn't see why he should pay anyone any more than that, according to Tony Bromwell, who worked for Apple. So the workers in the garden were very loyal to George. George was an equal to them in the garden, and he wanted to learn all he could from them. So George loved Friar Park, and Patty loved it too. She decorated the inside, choosing silks and Tiffany lamps. Friar Park, she felt, was George's house, and he would be making the decisions. George came home with an American woman named Chris Odell, and she was to be his new live-in personal assistant. She looked like George's favorite movie star, Goldie Hawn, so Patty was a little worried about her at first. So they didn't have anything going on, but George did try to put the moves on her a couple times, but she was able to turn him down without causing ill feelings between them. He was to appreciate her efficiency and trustworthiness, and she overlooked his ways. Okay, Chris felt like the place was like a mausoleum, but she acted enthusiastic about it to George. His other assistant, Doran, felt like the place was haunted. He thought he saw a figure of a strangely dressed man in the minstrel's gallery. He had vanished when he called out to it. And Chris never saw a spirit, but she didn't like the friar faces in the house. So Chris noticed that George had 3 different personalities. One George was funny, friendly, and gossipy. The other George was uptight, hypocritical, and sarcastic. And the third George was chanting under his breath or delivering spiritual rants. Chris appreciated his strict vegetarianism, but sometimes she had to go to the town to gaze into the butcher shop windows. So Chris found Patty to be kind of cool toward her before she found out that Chris didn't want George. She felt like even though Patty loved Friar Park, the place took away her sense of fun. Patty wanted to place flower arrangements outside the home, but George thought that it would be robbing the garden, so she had to get flowers from a florist in Henley. Chris said that George spent all day, every day, in gardening clothes and shapeless hats and rubber boots, and all he talked about was redeveloping the house and grounds. After Patty's birthday party, she turned 26 on March 17th, Patty talked to Chris. She said that since she married George, she wasn't able to have women friends without wondering if they were really after George. She told Chris she would like to be her friend if she didn't let George have her. So Chris said, "Okay, that's a deal. I'd much rather be your friend." So their friendship made the house more like an adventure playground than a mausoleum. And Chris did this without being disloyal to George, or Jeffrey, as Patty and Chris called him behind his back. They would explore passages to forgotten rooms, and Chris noticed that George still liked to take cocaine. Patty would ask her, "What's he got in his hand today, prayer beads or cocaine?" If he was in his spiritual place, you couldn't reach him, but if he was doing coke, he'd want to drink and party. So I'm going to stop right now in the video, and the next episode we'll continue to learn new things about George. And in this episode, we learned about Patty and George's marriage, George's friendship with Eric, and George's move to Friar Park. It seemed like George was always trying to find that great spiritual peace, but couldn't seem to be at the place he wanted to be. He was a complex man, and we're going to find out even more about George in the next video, and I hope you'll tune in. And thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.